So let me start recording the session and let me give you an overview or like an understanding of pivot table. Now, pivot table is one of the options in Excel which is considered as very, very important. So when we talk about the heart and the soul of MS Excel, it is always pivot table and VLOOKUP which are at the forefront. So when you talk about that, oh, I know Excel well, people presume that you are proficient with creating pivot tables, analyzing data with pivot tables, and you are comfortable with working with lookups like a VLOOKUP or those kind of things. Now, what is pivot table? Let me decode this term for you, okay, before the other participants join in, and then I can practically show it. Let us break this term. Can anyone in the chat box give me the meaning of pivot? What does pivot stand for? What does pivot stand for? Can anyone tell me? What does pivot stand for? Think, what does pivot? They say, oh, my life has been pivoted. Pivot means to rotate. I repeat, pivot means to rotate. And what is table? Table is a series of rows and columns. So when I talk about pivot table, I get the meaning of both the words. So it is a series of rows and columns which can be rotated. Now, when we talk about pivot table, why is it favored so much? Why do people like pivot table so much? Because it is used in analysis. It is used for reporting. It gives you concise values. It is very, very accurate. Okay. It gives you collated values. So not individual values, it gives you collated values. And what are the other advantages of using pivot table? You can use slicer and timeline filter in order to visually filter your pivot table. So what does a pivot table do? A pivot table is used in analysis. It is used for reporting, for generating tables, charts. It's a very, very concise tool. Pivot table is very, very accurate. And the other advantage of using a pivot table is it gives me collated values. It doesn't give me individual items. Let me look at this data. Here, Coca-Cola is appearing 11 times in this column. But do you think in my pivot table it will appear 11 times? Answer the question, yes or no. Will Coca-Cola appear 11 times in my data, in my pivot table? Please answer yes, no. Quickly, no. How many times will it appear? Anyone? How many times will pivot table appear in the data? How many times will Coke appear in the data? Anyone? How many times will Coca-Cola appear? In the data, each item, okay, or each unique item appears only once. What do I mean? Every item will appear only one time. Perfect, Kiran. Yes, every item will only and only appear one time. Is it clear? Any questions? Any queries? Okay. So pivot table will appear in the data just once. And we will be getting collated values. We will be getting concised values. Okay. And since the item will only appear one time in your pivot table, it will also work as a space saving tool. So basically, you will not be blocking 11 rows of data. And what will it do to the revenue? It will give you the average revenue, or it will give you the total revenue, or you can ask for the maximum revenue or the percentage of the revenue. So in this manner, the pivot table works. Now, can any data be used to create a pivot table? You can say yes also, you can say no. However, the data has to have certain prerequisites. What are the prerequisites? It should have header rows. That means there should be headers over here. Okay, there should be headers. Then no totals and subtotals in between, because they will be calculated double. Because at the end of the data, the pivot table is already going to give you a total and a subtotal. And that is why if your data also has totals and subtotals in between, they will get added. And that is why you will get magnified, or you will get very highly inflated values and not the actual values when you create your pivot table. Let us go ahead and let us talk about the other prerequisites. They should not be no blank rows. Okay, so you should remove the blank rows from the data. Now, with that given, it is a good practice if the data which you are using to create a pivot table is in table format. If the data that you want to represent in terms of your data is in table format, okay, then you can use pivot table. Is it clear, everyone? Now, how will you convert the data into a table? Can anyone tell me how can you convert the data into table? How can you convert your data into table? Can anyone tell me? How will you convert your data into table? In order to convert data into table format, you will select the whole data. You will do a control T. But can you see this data? Can you see this data? This data is already in table format. How can you tell that this data is already in table format? Can anyone tell me? Can anyone tell me? How do you know that the data is in table format? When you click on the data and you see table design appearing here, you will know that this data is in table format. And from here, you can directly summarize it as a pivot table. So there are multiple ways of creating a pivot table. If it is a table, you can go to insert and you can say pivot table, or under table design also, you have summarize with pivot table option. Summarize with pivot table will enable you to summarize this data in the form of a pivot table on a new sheet. So whether I click on summarize with pivot table from table design, or I go into insert and say pivot table, in both cases, this pivot table dialog box will pop up. From here, the pivot table dialog box will pop up. Select a table or a range. This is the table or the range. Choose where you want the pivot table to be placed. Now, there are two possibilities. You can place your pivot table on the same worksheet. That means on this sheet, which is called as beverage data, you can place your pivot table on this sheet. But you will need to specify which location you want to place the pivot table. You will need to specify which location. That means I have space here. So from cell O5 onwards, I would like to place my pivot table here. From cell O5 onwards, I would like to place my pivot table here. Okay. Is it clear? Any questions? Now, select the table or the range. This is the table or the range. Choose where you want the pivot table to be placed. We will say new worksheet. When I say new worksheet, that means it will put the pivot table on a new worksheet. That means sheet 10 or sheet 15 will be added, which will be a new worksheet on which the pivot table will be placed. So select a table or a range. So beverage data. Choose where you want the pivot table to be placed. New worksheet. Click on OK and now you will see, please be on mute. And now you will see a new sheet called sheet 1 where your pivot table placeholder has been put. In the pivot table fields, you will see certain headings. These headings are the same headings of my data. What are the headings here? Product name category, product, year, month, revenue, quantity. And these same headings are listed here in the pivot table fields. These same headings are listed here in the pivot table field. Can everyone try this much? Can everyone try this much? Please try this much. For those who have just joined, we have just begun with pivot table. Here I have written some of the key pointers to be kept in mind regarding a pivot table. A pivot table is a table whose rows and columns can be rotated. Pivot table is an analysis tool. Pivot table is an analysis tool which is used in order to generate reports. Pivot table gives you concise values. They are accurate values. Pivot table gives you collated values, and you can have a slicer or a timeline filter in order to filter your pivot table. In the pivot table, each item only appears one time. So for example, if Coca-Cola is appearing 12 times in the data, in your pivot table, Coca-Cola will appear once, orange juice will appear once. So all the items in the product column will only appear once in the pivot table. The values or the numbers associated with the pivot table will also be collated values. They will be aggregated values whose total and subtotals will be calculated. The data has to fulfill certain prerequisites. I repeat, the data has to fulfill certain prerequisites in order to be used in order to create a pivot table. What are the prerequisites? The headers, the headings, there should be row headings. So basically your columns should have headers. Okay, so here there should be headers. Okay, there should be no totals and subtotals in between the data. I repeat, there should be no totals and subtotals within the data. Also in the data, there should be no blank rows. I repeat, in the data, there should be no blank rows. These are certain key pointers to be kept in mind when you have data in order to convert it into a pivot table. When data is converted to a pivot table, it is a good practice if your data is already in table format. In order to convert data into table format, select the data and do a Control T. It will be converted into a table. In table design, you will see the table is already in tabular format, and even from table design, you can summarize it as a pivot table. Even from table design, you can summarize it as a pivot table. The other option is you go to insert and you can click on pivot table. One important option which we did not speak about is recommended pivot table. Recommended pivot table are recommendations given by the pivot table in order to create a pivot table based on your data. So after surveying and studying your data, Excel gives certain suggestions. After surveying and studying your data, Excel gives certain suggestions in order to convert your data into a pivot table. If you don't use pivot table option for 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, you will tend to forget pivot table, right? In that case, recommended pivot table will come to your rescue. I repeat, if you are not in touch with pivot table for a very long time, you may tend to forget pivot table. And in this scenario, where you forget pivot table, recommended pivot table will come to your rescue. What will recommended pivot table do? Recommended pivot table are recommendations given by Excel about the best way in which a pivot table can be created out of your data. You can click on this and here see these different presets. You can choose any one of these in order to represent your data. If you like it, you can click on OK. Otherwise, you can scroll and see the other options available. Once you click on OK, and this recommended pivot table will create a pivot table for you, you can make minor modifications on this in order to suit your goal of data reporting. In order to accomplish your goal of data reporting, you can choose from here a pivot table of your choice. Click on cancel here, and since we've already created a new sheet for pivot table, let us now talk about the pivot table fields. Now, very often what happens is, by mistake, we end up closing the pivot table fields. And even when we again click on this pivot table, the pivot table fields is not there. In that case, you have to go to pivot table analyze, and from the show area here, you have to click on the field list and enable the field list. It is a toggle button. So when you click again on it, it will close. Click again on it, it will come on. Every time you close and open the field list, the button will close and open. So you can close the field list from here, you can open the field list from here. Or you can go to the corner and close the field list. At the moment, I'm going to keep the field list on. In the pivot table field, just below the headers of your columns, which are given here, you will see drag field between the areas, drag fields over here. Before we randomly drag fields, it is very important to understand what is the significance. I repeat, it is very important to understand what is the significance of the items in this list. I repeat, it is very important to understand what the significance of these items are. So the first thing what we can do for these items over here in the pivot table fields is we need to come over here and we need to understand that rows and columns is for data. Rows and columns is for data. What type of data do you think will be in rows and columns? Since the data is text data type or it is a string, okay, they will be labels like category, subcategory, region, zone, location, department, manager name, reporting, manager, ship mode, ship date. So basically you will have in rows and columns items like these, which are mostly text in nature. In the value shelf, since the mathematical calculations here are sum, minimum, maximum, average, and count. I repeat, since in the value shelf, the items are sum, minimum, maximum, average, and count, the values over here will be numeric in nature. They will be numeric in nature. So what will you have here? Profit, quantity, sales values, amount, target, achieved. What else will you find? You will find salary here, discount. So these are the numeric values which will be in the value shelf. So row shelf and column shelf, you will have items which are text based. And in the value shelf, you will have items which are numeric in nature, on which you can perform a mathematical calculation like a sum, a minimum, maximum, average, count, percentage of total. Let us go to the first item here, product main category. Where do you think product main category will go? Quickly in the chat box. Can anyone tell me? Where will product main category go? Where will product main category go? Very, very quickly. Which shelf will product main category go? I'm waiting. Anyone? Will it go on the rows and the column shelf, or will it go on value shelf? Will it go here in rows and column shelf, or will it go in value shelf? So where will it go? Will it go here, or will it go in value shelf? Tell me. Where do you think it will go? Anyone? Where will product main category? According to me, since product main category is text and it falls in category, it will go either in the row shelf or in the column shelf. Yes, very good. Thank you. What about product? Product is like product main category. So product will also go in the row or column shelf. Let us go to year and month. Where do you think year and month will go? Year and month will also go in the row shelf or in the column shelf. Year will also go in the row and column shelf. What about revenue and quantity? What about revenue and quantity? Where do you think will the revenue and the quantity go? Exactly. Very good. Revenue and quantity will go in the value shelf. So when I drag an item in the row shelf and I drag an item in the value shelf, a pivot table will be created. A pivot table will be created. So let me take the product main category and let me take the revenue in the value. So what am I seeing over here? I see a pivot report where I have category wise revenue. What do I have over here? Category wise revenue. Now by default, it will always give me a sum of the revenue. By default, it will always give me the sum of the revenue. But if I do not want the sum of the revenue, I can double click and I can convert it to count of the revenue. Double click again and I can make it average of the revenue. Double click again and I can make it a minimum, maximum or a product. But by default, pivot table gives me the value as sum always. By default, it will always give me the value in a sum. Suppose under the product name category, I would like to drag the products. In order to drag the products under the product name category, all I have to do is drag the products here. Now I could drag it above this. I could drag it below. See what happens when I drag it above it. Under apple juice, you will see the category it is. Under chips, you will see the category. Instead of this, if I drag the main category on top and I put the product under it, isn't this option looking better? In fact, this is nested items in the row shelf, whereby I have this minus sign or this collapsing button where I can collapse individual items. If I go to pivot table analyze and I click on collapse here, it will collapse all fields. And if I click on expand here, it will expand all fields. Again, click on collapse, click on expand. Collapse will collapse all fields, expand will expand all fields. Please try it. Please create this simple. Any questions, any queries? Anyone wants anything to be repeated? Let me know. Are you all done? Okay. Let us go ahead and let me talk to you a little bit more about adding items to the row shelf and the column shelf. Now, we all use social media platforms. We all use the smartphone or a tablet or an iPad. When we hold the device in our hands, what is the direction that we scroll? Up to down, down to up. So that is why we are conditioned to read data in vertical format. And you will also notice VLOOKUP is more popular than HLOOKUP. Okay, we are used to reading data in vertical format, and VLOOKUP is more popular than HLOOKUP. Another very important thing is when you have to drag item, the item which has more number of entities, the item which has more number of entities, it is better to put it in the row shelf than in the column shelf. See what happens? See how this looks? Can you see this? Is this looking better or was this looking better? Definitely this is looking better. Even try this option. Is this looking better? I still feel the previous one was looking. Now, if I want to add regions also, I can come here. And there are no regions in this, but there is year. So I can take the year. Now, by putting the year in the column shelf, I have the year 2015 and 16 over here in my column shelf. Now, if I would like to filter the data, I can go to row labels, and from here, I can select the field from where I want to filter the data. If I want to filter the data product wise, I'll click here and I can filter from here product wise. If I want to remove the filter, I'll come here and say clear filter from products. Similarly, if I want to filter the data based on product main category, I can filter the data from here based on product main category. Click on OK. When I click on column labels, I can filter the data which is in the column shelf from the column label button. I repeat, if I click down on the column labels drop down, from here I can filter the data based on which column I would like to see in terms of data. So whether I want to see 2015 or I want to see data for 2016, I can decide from here. So if I want to filter out item in the row shelf or in the column shelf, I have to click on the drop down and filter. Please try this everyone before we go ahead. Please try this everyone before we go ahead. Please try this. Any questions, any queries, you can let me know in the chat box. Okay. Now suppose you want to filter the month. I'm asking you all a question. Suppose you want to filter the month. Suppose you want to filter the month. Can you filter the month? Is the month there in the row shelf or the column shelf? No. So if you want to filter an item which is not there in the row shelf or in the column shelf, I repeat, if you want to filter your data based on an item which is neither there in the row shelf nor in the column shelf, then you will drag the item to the filter shelf. Take the item and put it in the filter shelf. If the item is in row shelf or column shelf, then you can filter from here. But if the item you want to filter based on is neither there in row shelf nor in the column shelf, then that item has to be dragged and dropped in the filter shelf. Drag and drop it in the filter shelf. You have all here. And from here, you can choose the items. At the moment and by default, all is always selected. If I want only the data for Jan, I will click on Jan and say, okay, I will see the data for Jan. Click again over here. And if I want the data for Feb, I will click here and I will see the data for Feb. But if I want the data for Jan, Feb, March, and April, I will click on the drop down here. There is a select multiple items checkbox. The select multiple items checkbox allows you to multi-select items. Select multiple items allows you to multi-select items. So select multiple items and say OK. And now we have selected multiple items over here. Now we have selected multiple items over here. Now, the disadvantage of selecting multiple items is you have to go under the drop down to see which multiple items have been selected. But yes, you can select multiple items from the filter shelf by using the select multiple items checkbox. Please try this everyone. I have introduced this topic with a smaller data set. The reason being is because I would like to explain each option in detail. Once you are comfortable with the nuances and the workflow, we will go to Sample Superstore, which is a relatively larger data set. Please try. Please try everyone. Good work. Okay. Now, how will you clear a pivot table? In order to clear a pivot table, either you can drag and drop items outside in this manner. The other way is from the checkbox, you will simply uncheck the options. The next option which I'm going to talk to you about is grouping data within a pivot table. In order to group the data in a pivot table, you can manually group the data by creating groups. For example, put the products here. Take the quantity here. If the first three products I would like to put in a particular group, all I have to do is select them, and under pivot table analyze, I have to click on group selection. What does group selection do? It will take these three items and put it in a group. Okay, it will take these three items and put it in a group. When I click on it and put it in a group, the remaining items which follow, that is fruits, nuts, orange juice, sandwiches, and sparkling water, they will be put into individual groups. I repeat, the first three items will be put in one group. The remaining items will be put into individual groups. Click on group selection, and here I have group 1 where all the items have been. Rename this group 1. I'm going to rename this group 1 over here, and I'm going to make this quick snacks. Okay, so I made this quick snacks. Then if I want to make another group, I will select these items and I will come here and say group selection. Make sure when you are selecting, you select the label and the item both. For example, for sandwiches, if I only select this sandwich and not what is inside, it will only make a group of fruits, nuts, and orange juice. Sandwich will be left behind. If I want to include sandwich, I have to include all 4 items. Click on insert slicer. Click on group selection and write over here the name of the group, that is healthy options. And finally, we have the last thing, which is sparkling water, which could be in the drinks category. Okay, so these are the different items which I have grouped manually. This is the first type of grouping. I repeat, this is the first type of grouping, that is manual grouping in a pivot table. I repeat, this is the first type of grouping, which is a manual grouping in the pivot table. Please try. Also, if you notice in the row shelf, you have product and you have product 2. Product 2 is the second item which has been added because I have made these groups. If I uncheck product 2, see what happens? The groups are not there. If I put the checkbox on product 2, you will see the items have got the groups, but it has been put down in the row shelf. So I can click here and I can say move up, or I can manually move it up. Also, I find the manual moving up a little bit quicker to work with. Please try. Any questions, any queries, let me know. Please try, everyone. Please try this, everyone. Let me know when you're complete. Let me know when you're complete creating your groups. Okay. Have you all completed creating the groups? Now, another advantage of using data in table format to create a pivot table is when a new column is added or when a new entry is added, you can refresh your pivot table and fetch your data in your pivot table. I'm going to click on insert and I'm inserting a new column. I'm going to go to my source data, which is beverage data. And in my beverage data, I'm inserting a new column. And here I'm going to call this as product code. Product code column is a column where I will be writing numeric values 1001, and then I will come to the corner, hold down control and pull it down. By doing so, it will copy these numeric values till the very end of my data set. Now, when I click over here on beverage data, you will see that this particular data has not been taken into my table. In order to make sure that this data is added to my table, I will go to table design. I'll click on resize table, and instead of selection from B1, I will change it to A1. Now you will see that the column A has also been taken in my selection of beverage data 1. I want you all to go to the beverage data sheet and add a new column to the beverage data. I want you to go to the beverage data sheet and add a new column with entries. In order to get numbers in sequential order, write the number, come to the corner of the cell, hold control and pull it. You will get the number one after the other with an increase of 1. You will get the numbers one after the other with an increase of 1. Please try, everyone. So I want you all to add a new column called product code in the beverage data and make sure you resize your table to take that new column into consideration. Make sure you resize that table to take the new column into consideration. Please try everyone. Let me know when you all complete. Once you've added a new column, you go to the sheet 1, which has your pivot table. And under pivot table, you have refresh. Click on refresh all. Refresh all will bring in all the new data. And now you will see a new entry, which is the product code, which has been added in the pivot table field. Now, the reason why I added this new column is because I want to show you the second type of grouping, which is grouping based on number values. Grouping based on number values can be done when there is a column which has items which are unique to the items in the other column. So product code is one such column which has items which stand for 1 for each item in the product column or the product name category column. So the product code column has codes related to the products given in the columns. In order to group based on numeric value, you need to take the number value in the row shelf. So I can group based on revenue because revenue is a numeric value. I can also group based on quantity because quantity is also a numeric value. For now, I'm going to take the revenue in the row shelf. As soon as I put the revenue in the row shelf, I will need to put an item in the column shelf. In the column shelf, I am coming and I'm going to take the product code, an item, which is 1 for every item in the column. So something that is unique for all the products or the employees. So this has unique values. I will put it in the value shelf. By default, you will get the sum of the product code because whichever item you take in your value shelf, you will always get the sum of that item. I repeat, whatever item you have in the value shelf, you will always get it as a summed up value. Double click on it, and if you do not want sum, you can click on count and click on OK, and you will get the count of the product code. I repeat, you will get the count of the product code. Click on the first item in the row shelf, and under group category, you will see group selection and you will also see group field. Now, whether you click on group selection or you click on group field, the same pop-up will open. Whether you click on group selection or you click on group field, the same pop-up will open. But formerly, there was only group selection. But now you have group field also. Earlier, there was only group selection. But now you have group field also. Click on group field and here you can decide the starting point and the ending. The starting point is 100. I'm going to round off the ending point to 700. Difference by 100 and I will click on OK. Now you can see between 100 to 200, you have 36. Between 200 to 400, you have 12. So here you see that I have grouped it. Click on group selection. You can see over here the starting point is 100. The ending point is 700 and the difference is of 100. So between every 100 items, you will see how many products fall in that particular category. So which products have generated more revenue? So here you can see 78 products are in the revenue category of 500 to 600. In order to ungroup it, click on ungroup and remove the items. I'm going to show you this one more time so that you can follow along and then you can repeat it for the quantity column. Click on revenue, drag and drop the revenue in the row shelf. In the value shelf, drag and drop anything which is equal to the count of 1 for one product. Click on product code, click and drag. By default, you will always get the sum of the product codes. By default, you will always get the sum of the product codes. If you do not want the sum of the product codes, you can go ahead and double click on this and change the value field settings from sum to a count. Click on OK and this is the count of the product codes. Click on the first item in the row label and under pivot table analyze, we have the group field, and under group we have group selection and we have group field. Now, irrespective of whether you click on group selection or you click on group field, the same pop-up will open. Whether you click on group selection or you click on group field, the same pop-up will open. When you click on group selection, this is the older option, whereas group field is the newer option, which has been created to group numeric or date fields. Since the revenue is a numeric field, we can use group field to group it. Again, starting point is starting of the number, that is 100. Ending is the ending point. I will change the ending to 700. And in by, I will change the difference of 100. There is a difference of 100 over here. So between 100 to 700 is the flow. The difference is 100 between the items. Click on OK. And here you can see the distinct groups being created and the count of the product codes relevant to the group that they belong to. This is grouping based on a numeric value. I would like you all to try for revenue and then repeat it for quantity. Group based on quantity, difference of 75. Please try. Please try and let me know. Okay. Have you all completed for quantity? Yes? Has everyone completed for quantity? Someone let me know in the chat, please. Okay, great. Thank you. Now, based on this data now, I am going to insert a slicer. Now, what is a slicer? A slicer is a visual filter, which will enable you to visually filter your data. A slicer is a visual filter, which will enable you to visually filter your data. So you can take your data, which is put in your pivot table, and visually filter it with the help of buttons by using the slicer. A slicer can be applied on any one of these columns. Click on slicer and let us apply a slicer on the products. Click on OK. This is my slicer applied for my products column. Now, as soon as I create a slicer and a slicer appears on my Excel sheet, you will see a new tab here called slicer, which is relevant to this. When the pivot table is selected, you will see pivot table analyze and design. But when the slicer is selected, you will see the slicer related buttons. Now, once you see the slicer related buttons, you can change the color of the slicer. That's the first thing. You can change the caption of the slicer. That means from product, I can change it to product names. And click outside, you'll see the name comes product names. I can add more columns to my slicer. I can increase the height of my slicer buttons. And I can reduce this in size. I can also change the height and width of the slicer, which I was doing manually. I can do it from here. So this size option is the size of the slicer, whereas this height and width is the height and width of the buttons. This height and width is the height and the width of the buttons. Now, by default, every slicer is always in one column. But if you realize that there are many items and you end up scrolling through your slicer, you can always increase it to more items, to more columns, so that your items get distributed across columns. Now, let me show you how the slicer or the visual filter works. When I click on apple juice, you will see the data only relevant to apple juice in the pivot table. So basically using this, I am filtering this table. Click on chips, you're seeing the data for chips. Coke, you're seeing the data for Coke. Nuts, data for nuts. Orange juice, data for orange juice. Sandwiches, fruits. In order to clear the slicer, click on this clear filter option. It will clear the slicer and now you can see all the data. So now what I want you all to do is select your pivot table, go to pivot table analyze, and under the filter, click on insert slicer and choose the products column. Now a slicer will be applied on the products column for you. Please apply the slicer and then make the changes to the slicer like I showed you. Increasing the number of columns, increasing the height of the buttons, reducing the size of the slicer, changing the color of the slicer, adding name to the slicer caption are some of the changes that you can make. Please try everyone. Insert a slicer. Have you all completed? Yes, everyone completed slicer. Now, after doing the slicer, we can also multi-select items in the slicer. For example, if I want to select apple juice, nuts and sandwiches, click on apple juice, hold control, click on nuts, hold control, click on sandwiches. So in order to select multiple items in your slicer, hold control on the keyboard. By holding the control on the keyboard, you can select multiple items in your slicer and visually filter your data. Clear the slicer. And now let me show you the idea of multi-select items in the same sequence. If I want to select all the data from apple juice till fruits. So I want apple juice, I want chips, I want Coke, and I want fruits. I'll click on apple juice, shift key, click on fruits. Click on apple juice, shift key, click on fruits. By holding down the shift key, you can select everything that comes in the sequence. You can select everything that comes in the sequence. So it will take apple juice till fruits, everything. In order to clear the slicer, you can click on clear slicer option and it will clear the slicer for you and give you. So control to multi-select far placed items. Hold shift key down to multi-select items which are very, very close to each other or in the same line or in the same sequence of items. You will also see an option here which is called as multi-select. Suppose you want to select all items, but you only want to exclude fruits. I repeat, I want to select all items and I only want to exclude fruits. Do you think I will sit like this and I will click? Will I be doing this? No. Instead of this, I will click on multi-select. Multi-select will select all items. Then all I have to do is click on fruits and exclude fruits. So multi-select will keep all items selected and I can exclude that one item that I would like to remove. Clear this, remove multi-select. Let me go through this one more time. Control to multi-select multiple items, far placed. Shift to multi-select one after the other. Multi-select to select all and also sometimes you may want to use the slicer in a single row. That means you would want the slicer in a single row. In that case, select your slicer, go to slicer, add more columns. How many columns will you add? The number of items that are there, you will add so many columns and then reduce the size. So you will get your slicer like a, like a dashboard type look and feel where there is one strip and you can visually filter. Now, a common mistake which happens is we apply the slicer, we filter the data, but we delete the slicer. If you do that, your data will show you the entire data. But just in case it is still showing you a filtered version of the data, you can come here and you can simply clear the filter from there. Excuse me. You can simply click there and clear the filter from there. Please try this, everyone. Making your slicer one strip. Please try making your slicer in one strip. Please try this, everyone. Please try this, everyone. Okay. Once you all have completed it, delete the slicer and let us go back to pivot table analyze. Now inside pivot table analyze, we also have a timeline filter. And this will help you in order to filter time series data. But in this data, the time is only given in terms of month and year. It is not given in proper date format. And that is why at this point of time, we will go to sample superstore in order to convert this into a pivot table. And we will use the timeline slicer on this particular data. In order to select the data, we'll do a control A, and let us first begin by converting this data into table format. Control T to convert it into table. So where is the data for your table? So this is the data for your table. My table has headers. Yes, the table has headers. Click on OK. And once you do that, you will see that your data has been converted into table format. For step 1, I want you all to convert the data of sample superstore into table format. Convert the data of sample superstore into table format. Please try. Please try, everyone. Now, once you convert the data into table format, we are now going to go under table design, and under tools you have summarize with pivot table. Under tools you have summarize with pivot table. Summarize with pivot table will enable you in order to convert this data into a pivot table format. Click on this. They will ask you table 2. Yes, this table has been named table 2. Where do you want the pivot table to be placed? On a new worksheet? Click on OK. And here you have your new worksheet where your pivot table has been created. Now, the items in the row shelf, the items in the column shelf, and the items in the value shelf will remain the same. I repeat, the items in the row shelf, the items in the column shelf, and the items in the value shelf will remain the same. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here. I'm going to put the segment in the row shelf. Then I'm going to take a numeric value like the sales and put it in the value shelf. Now what I'm seeing is I'm seeing the segment wise data, but I want my pivot table to be a little more comprehensive. So I'm going to take the region and I'm going to put the region. So now I have the region. Under the region, I have segments and I have the sum of the sales. In order to convert the sum of the sales into percentage-wise values, I can double click on sum of sales. Instead of summarize value by, I will say show value as. Instead of summarize value by, I will click on show value as. And in the drop down, I will say percentage of grand total. Percentage of grand total will enable me in order to show my data in the form of grand total. Click on OK, and here I have the percentage wise values of my data. Here I have the percentage wise values of my data. Please create this much before we can go ahead with one more example of slicer, and then we will begin with the timeline filter, because in this data there are two time series data. There is order date and there is a ship date. Now we are going to insert a slicer. Has everyone completed this much? Can someone let me know in chat? If they have completed this much, then I can show you the next example of a slicer. Okay, thank you. Okay, now we are going to go to insert slicer. Earlier also when we went to insert slicer, we were selecting an item or a column based on which we wanted to apply our slicer. But right now I'm going to apply two slicers. I'm going to apply two slicers. I'm going to apply a slicer on the category, and I'm going to apply another slicer on the subcategory. When I apply two slicers, one slicer becomes the main slicer and the second slicer is dependent on the main slicer. Click on OK, and here you can see the data. Click on OK, and here you can see the data. Now here you can see the category slicer, which is the main slicer, and subcategory comes under category only. So when I apply a slicer, in order to visually filter the data based on furniture category, you will see in subcategory only those items are highlighted which belong to the category furniture. So under furniture, the subcategories which fall, only those will be available for selection. The other items in the subcategory slicer will be grayed out. Clear the filter from furniture, and now you will see in subcategory all the items are available. Click on office supplies, and now you will only see those subcategories which are a part of the category office supplies. Click on technology, and only items available under technology are available for selection in the subcategory. So basically what happens over here is the main slicer will affect the sub slicer, which will in turn affect the quantity of data you will get to use in terms of a filter. In order to clear the slicer, you can clear in the same way. Alt C is the keyboard shortcut. Alt plus C. So Alt C, keyboard key, Alt plus letter C will enable you to clear your slice. Please try this, applying two slicers. And if anyone wants anything to be repeated, please let me know that as well. If anyone wants anything to be repeated, please let me know that as well. Okay. Once you are done, clear the slicer and delete the slicer after clearing them. And now we are going to apply the timeline filter or the timeline slicer. Insert timeline or the timeline slicer is available under the filter group only. This shows that this also acts like a filter only. However, the type of data which it affects is time and date series data. So under insert timeline, when you click on it to apply a slicer or a visual filter, you will only get date fields or date columns available for the purpose of selection. But when you click on insert slicer, you will get all fields available for the purpose of selection. But when you click on insert timeline, you will only see date fields. Click on order date or click on ship date. If you click on both, this has happened in the past. If you click on both, but you choose different windows. So for example, you see order date 2018 and for ship date, you apply a slicer for 2019. Both the years which we are seeing are different, and that is why you will not be seeing any data on your pivot table. And that is why when you begin applying a timeline filter or when you begin applying filter to time series data, always begin with a single slicer. Click on order date, click on OK, and here you have your timeline slice. You can come to the corner and increase the size. You can come to the bottom and increase the size. In order to increase the size of this, you can also click from here to increase widthwise. You can increase from here to increase height. If you see the timeline slicer tab is active now. So when the timeline is selected, you will see timeline tab active here. Just as when the slicer was selected, the slicer tab was active here. Under timeline caption, you can change the order date to any other caption that you would like to apply to your data. You can change it to any other caption that you would like to apply to your data. Can everyone create this much before we go ahead? Can everyone create this much before we go ahead? Create this, then I'll show you these coloring settings, this show option. Once you've created the timeline slicer, you can apply different timeline colors to it from here, from the drop down. in order to suit your other items kept on your sheet. Now let us understand this show tab. When I close header, you will see the timeline caption goes away. This can be very confusing because you will not know what time series data that you are filtering according to. So keep the header on. You also have a scroll bar here. So this scroll bar will enable you to move around your data. If you don't want to use the scroll bar, you can also use these buttons. They work equally well, but the scroll bar is more like a slider. If you uncheck the scroll bar, you will not have the scroll bar. You will only have these buttons which were on either end of the scroll bar, and they will help you to move around your data. Generally, people turn off the scroll bar in order to save space on their sheet. You also have selection label. Selection label, I've turned it off and on, shows you on what period you've applied the filter. So now if you see in selection label, you will see November 2017 to March 2018, which shows that I have applied a filter for this particular data. I have applied a selector for this particular data. In order to clear the timeline filter or the slicer as we call it, you can use Alt-C keyboard shortcut or use this filter sign to clear. Next to selection label, you have time level. Time level shows you the manner in which you are seeing the data. So here we are seeing in month-wise. When we see the data month-wise, we get the years and the months. When we see the data quarter-wise, we see quarter and the year. And when we see the data year-wise, we only see the data year-wise. If you want more granularity or if you want more flexibility, always see the data month-wise, because when you are seeing the data month-wise, you will automatically see the year to which the month belongs to on the top. When you close the time level, you will not be able to see the manner in which or what you have chosen in terms of your data viewing of your time. You can turn it on. Another very important thing is at the moment in the selection label, you will see a particular period being selected. When a particular period is selected, you will see clear filter active. Click on it and now you will see in selection label all periods. When all periods of data is being shown, it actually means that no filter is applied. When all periods are shown, it actually means that no periods are selected. And because no periods are selected, in the selection label, you will see that the clear option is disabled. Because there is no filter applied, there is no scope to clear the filter. Because there is no filter applied, there is no scope to clear the filter. Please try the timeline slicer, everyone. Please try the timeline slicer or the timeline filter. Please try this, everyone. Timeline slicer or timeline filter. Once you all complete this, please give me a heads up. And then under pivot table, we will go to the design aspect. And then under the pivot table, we will go to the design aspect of the pivot table. Have you all completed, everyone? Please let me know, and then we can begin with the design aspect of the pivot table. In the pivot table design aspect, when you click on design, when you click on design aspect and you click on design, you will see over here pivot table styles. You will see over here pivot table styles. These are basically formatting like you apply to a normal table, which are being used on your pivot table in order to give it a professional look and feel. And you can choose one depending upon the color combination that you would like. Next to pivot table style, you have the pivot table style options. These pivot table style options allow you to make your row headers bold, like banded. They allow you to make your column headers banded. And you can add banded rows and banded columns in order to segregate the data in your pivot table in a better manner. So this is banded rows, banded columns. So you can add banded rows and banded columns to your data. Let me add some more data over here in order to start banded rows and banded columns so that you can see the bifurcation of the banded columns. This thin white line is the banded columns, and these banded rows are the alternating light and dark colors. Column headers are the headings where your columns get a fill color, and row headers are the headings of your individual rows of the subdivision. Now let us go to subtotals. Now by default, if you see in a pivot table, the subtotals are always given at the top of the group. Now pivot table is a concise tool. It's a space saving tool. It tries to give you maximum reporting or maximum detailing of its report in least space. So pivot table believes in using space optimally. That means if you have millions of rows of data, you can represent it in the form of maybe thousands of rows using a pivot table. That is because pivot tables gives you collated values. It analyzes the values and gives you concised values, crisp values. And that is why over here, the subtotals are always given at the top of the group because there is one row of data going empty Okay, so by default, they give you subtotals at the top of the group. So basically, these three values, subtotal is given here in this yellow cell. These three values, the total is given in this cell. So I'll color the values with red and I will color the total in yellow. But if you would like the subtotal to show at the bottom of the group, because we are reading data always with data and the total, data and subtotal. So say show subtotal at the bottom of the group. When you click on this, you will see that the row next to central, you will see that the row next to central goes blank and central total, a new subtotal row has been added over here. Central total or a new subtotal row has been added over here. Click over here and say do not show subtotal. Now it is not showing you subtotals at all. But at the end of the data, you are able to see grand totals. At the end of the data, you are able to see grand totals. So when you click on subtotals and you say subtotals at the top of the group, it will put it in the row going empty. If you click on here, you will say bottom of the group, it will put it at the bottom of the group. But by default, when a subtotal is created, it is always created at the top of the group in order to save space. Now, what I want you to do is try out pivot table style, try out style options, and try subtotal. Because after this, I'm going to show you grand total. Please try subtotal. Please try. Okay, now let's go to grand total. Grand total over here can be applied for row and for column. I'm turning the grand total off. You will see that there will be one grand total at the end of the row and you will see there will be a grand total at the end of the column. Click on grand total and say on for columns. These are your column grand total. So furniture grand total, office supplies grand total, technology grand total. But if I come to grand total and I say on for rows only, it will put on the grand total only for the rows. So you can toggle between on for rows, on for columns, and if you want on for rows and columns, you can click on this. The second option here will put on the grand total for your columns and for your rows. So if you want grand total for rows and for columns, you turn on option number 2. To turn off all grand totals, you click on this option. Now here you can see the grand total for the different segments and the regions. You can also see the grand total for the categories in the column. Now, if you see over here, when I want to filter based on segment or region, I will have to click here, choose the field and then select. Because since pivot table is a space saving tool, both segment and region are in the same column. But under report layout, it is being shown in compact view because compact form is the default form of showing your data in a pivot table. However, we can show the data of a pivot table in an outline form. You'll get an extra column for region and for segment. So now the region and the segment are no longer nested one below the other. The region and the segment are no longer nested one below the other. Under report layout, I can say show tabular form. And this is a table type format where the banded rows are given between different groups of the regions. And this again gives you segment and region in two separate columns. To filter based on region, you can click on here. To filter based on segment, you can click on here. Click on report layout here. And if you say repeat all items, it will repeat central in this whole section and east in this whole section. However, it is understood that central is the main region and these are the segments under it. But for reporting purposes, if you would like to repeat items, you can click on repeat items from the drop down. Repeat all items will repeat the items for you. If you do not want to repeat items, click on do not repeat items. Click again on the drop down and say repeat all items. It will repeat all the items and give it to you. Click again over here, click on do not repeat item labels and it will not repeat the item labels. Similarly, if you feel your data is too congested or your data is too cluttered, you can add blank rows after each item. By adding blank rows after each item, you will get some breathing space between your regions. Click on insert blank line after each item. So after each item, a blank row will be inserted in order to make your report a little less cluttered. Click on blank rows and say remove blank line after each item. When I click on remove blank line after each item, it will remove the blank line after each item and give me the data as it is. Please try this report layout and blank rows. Please try this report layout and blank rows. Okay. Now, if you click on pivot and table analyze, when you click on pivot table analyze, when the pivot table has one cell selected, you will see pivot table name, pivot table 3. I suggest always when you are going to further use these pivot tables in order to create dashboards, always rename this. And click outside anywhere, the name will get saved. Now this pivot table has a name. It's called region-wise segment. In this way, you will exactly know what is the data that has been analyzed or studied on this particular pivot table. Another thing which you can do to your pivot table is you can take the profit and add it to the value shelf. Now, I have my sum of sales in percentage format and I have my sum of profit in number values. I can change the name over here of sum of sales to percent sales. Okay. And it will change all of them to percent sales. So this is percent sales relevant to furniture, percent sales relevant to office supplies, and percent sales relevant to technology. This is the total percentage of sales, and this is the total sum of the profit. Now, what I would like you to do is, using this knowledge, what we have shared today, I would like you to go and create a pivot table with sample superstore. I would like you to create a pivot table. And if anyone has any doubts or queries, let me know. I'll just take your attendance. In the meanwhile, you all can continue working on the pivot table. If anyone has created anything interesting with regard to pivot table, please do share. Also requesting all participants to rename themselves for the purpose of attendance because it becomes very difficult to identify people with user ID. Please let me know if you all have any questions or queries, or if anyone wants any topic in pivot table to be explained again. If anyone wants any topic in pivot table to be explained again, because today we have done pivot table in detail. This is the basis for your dashboards and reporting. In next week's session, we will be covering graphs and charts, pivot charts and dashboards. So next Thursday when we meet for the session, we will be covering charts, graphs, pivot tables and